All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another CrowdLinker Fireside Chat. I'm Aram Melkoumov, the host. Thanks for tuning in. On the show, I'm interviewing product and innovation leaders who are working on big industry disruptive problems from within their organizations. The guests that I have on the show have been in the trenches and have lots of practical advice to share about building quality digital products, staying agile, and fostering an innovation mindset. This is season 2, episode number 7, and I'm here with Eran Ben-Ari to chat about his untraditional path into product management, building and scaling technology teams, emerging technologies, and their impact on product development, as well as his top insights from working with many different product organizations along the way. Eran is an experienced B2C and B2B executive leader with a proven track record in defining successful products, building cohesive cross-functional teams, and improving product development processes. Eran is currently the Chief Platform Officer at BenchSci, there we go, which is empowering scientists. BenchSci, all right. Yeah. Which is empowering scientists with the world's most advanced biomedical artificial intelligence to run more successful experiments, and on its path to reduce by 50% the time it takes to develop new drugs and bring them to patients. So very, very interesting company. Previously, Eran had held Chief Product Officer roles at Top Hat, Kick Interactive, as well as VP of Product and Growth roles at Rounds, Hola, and Campfly, which were all acquired. So without further ado, awesome having you on our show. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you so much. Very excited to be here.
Cool. So first question I'll ask is just giving us a little bit of background, introducing yourself to our audience, kind of what you're working on now and where you're based.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm based here in Toronto, Canada. I'm working for BenchSci. As you said, it's a company at the intersection between, I would say, biology and bioinformatics and AI and machine learning. And it's building the world's largest biomedical experimental knowledge base. Imagine that you take lots and lots, millions and millions of records of published, publicly available, experiments that scientists are running, and we ingest that into our knowledge base in a way that allows us to then provide very useful insights to scientists as they develop new medicine and new drugs. Now, the top, I would say, 16 out of the top 20 pharmaceutical companies are already strategic partners to the company. These are like big, large, enterprise customers, and our company is only 5 years old. So I think that's a fantastic place to be. And I think a lot of what we do is really trying to articulate how we can identify lots of very useful information that when scientists make decisions around their experiments, they can leverage our knowledge base. And I'll give just one specific example, and I think that's our flagship product. When you are selecting a reagent, something that you want, a protein type or anything else that you want to run an experiment with, many times it's difficult for you to identify which reagent you should be choosing, right? Because there are many, many different options out there. So usually what happens is you maybe do some literature review, read a few articles, right? Or you may have some experience within the company itself. But BenchSci allows you to have this like very macro view where you're coming and saying, okay, I want to choose a specific reagent for this experiment, and based on a lot of different parameters, we can surface to the scientists what is the best one to choose, right? And that allows them to then increase the probability that the experiments will be successful, and then that entails also saving lots of time, right, in that preclinical side of things, then develop the drugs more successfully and with a high success rate.
It's a really interesting company, and I think with what's happening today in the world, I think it's very timely to have this type of technology available to scientists in different shapes and forms. So very, very cool. I'm sure you're excited to have recently joined this company as one of their new leaders. So very cool to see what comes out of it or during your tenure there.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I wanted to ask, I know with this company, you mentioned before that it's really, an artificial intelligence, machine learning type of company. And, in your history, previously to this role and your other roles, I know that you had an untraditional path to product management. I believe you studied anthropology at a PhD level, and you worked in both marketing and growth, and managed a large engineering team in your prior roles. How did those experiences impact the way you approach product today?
Yeah, a great question, and I agree. I have an untraditional path. And I think if I go back maybe 15, 16 years when I made that transition into tech, I just finished a master's degree in anthropology. I spent a year long doing field work at a school to better understand, how is educational success built, engineered, so-called, right? And then in my PhD, that I have an unfinished dissertation I need to complete one day. I tried to understand what are the cultural determinants of spreading new technologies, right? And I looked at one, very famous Google product called Google Analytics that diffused around the world very, very quickly. And I tried to understand what's behind that, right? Why is it so persuasive? Why do people use that? And it's becoming so integral to their work. And if I connect the dots, I think anthropology allows you to have the tools to do two things. One is to deeply, deeply understand things from the users, on the end user, on the customer end, around how they're interpreting technology into their own mental models and how do they make sense of those technologies. So I think that's one side of things, which then allows you to then cater to what that product should look like, right? And bridge the gap between the two, between the expectation, the perceived value and the actual value. And I think the second thing is anthropology equips you with tools or techniques that allows you to deeply frame a problem space in a way that makes sense not to you in the company and not to your investor necessarily, but in a way that makes sense to the customer, him or herself. And I'll give you a very concrete example. In one of the companies that I worked for, I joined as a VP Marketing and Growth. It was Hola, and it was a VPN, right? So VPN allows you to mask your IP. And when I joined the company, if you would go to their homepage, the messaging there would say, come and configure your own server, basically, right? Something according to those lines, right? Which makes a ton of sense for an engineer, right? And the company was 70 people, 68 of them were engineers, and probably by far the most educated and smartest people that I've met until that time. But it did not resonate with end users, right? Because most end users are not engineers. So going out to the field and speaking both with prospects, but also with existing customers, and very quickly getting to the point that you understand that back then Netflix was not available outside the United States. Configuring a server is not the messaging. The messaging is Netflix away from home.
Exactly.
Right? And I think it's a small, tiny example that with the tools that you're equipped as an anthropologist, you can go and deeply understand the ecosystem that you're operating in, and then come back. In this particular example, it's articulating the messaging in a much better way that is easily understood by the end users, right? But I think more broadly, I'm seeing more and more, I would say, social science majors, psychologists, anthropologists, sociologists moving into tech. And I think they bring a whole set of tools or a toolbox that allows them to deeply understand what they're building and why they're building that, and why would that increase the probability that even in the version 1 of it, it will deliver disproportionate value to their end users and customers.
Interesting. Yeah, I was gonna say actually, I know more and more anthropologists or people who are coming out of school who are going into product management roles early on, because it's a very key part, I think, of a successful product development to take those things into mind. On what you were saying there, what's something that you would have never learned along the way into your career, if not for that time or those experiences you had in your life to date?
So I've been very fortunate in my previous life. As a kid, I moved around a lot. So I grew up in England, Japan, Singapore, and in Israel. And I think it forced me to be very almost like humble by design that I don't know the answers to things. Because the way you eat, even at dinner, right, in each one of these countries is very different. Or what's the concept of a dinner is even very different in each one of these countries. So it actually pushed me to become an anthropologist, right? And actually try and be very like aware that I'm an observer on the users and the customers. I'm not them, right? And having that distance, I think also helped me many times when I joined companies. Especially I would say, collaborating with engineers, sometimes they have a really cool technology or they have a solution in mind, but they're not actually solving the right problem, right? So having that distance, I think that came through both my childhood, but also my upbringing in anthropology. And I think the second thing is, again, it's the tools themselves, right? How do you frame a good qualitative research question? How do you match the right research method to the question you're asking? How do you know that you have enough so-called statistical significance in qualitative data? What's that saturation level, right? And there are all kinds of heuristics and all kinds of techniques that allow you to have almost like quantitative analytic, I would say, confidence in the qualitative data, while still relying on a very small sample size, but still extrapolating that to a larger audience, which I think allows to speed up a lot of decision making within product management.
Very interesting. I know you worked at a lot of different companies in different roles, but let's kind of just fast forward to the current role at BenchSci. So as a chief platform officer, I know you're involved in like helping them scale their engineering, their product R&D, and maybe more specifically their science teams. But before that, you were managing, I think, 40 people at Kick and over 120 people at Top Hat. What have you learned along the way about building and scaling teams from those prior roles?
I would say a few different things. That scaling is difficult, right? And also you need to constantly have realistic expectations around what you're expecting to have and by which time horizon from that scaling exercise, right? Mm-hmm. And we had some conversations, just before the call around the companies I worked for are not Amazon, right? We're not scaling into hundreds of thousands of people. Yeah. The scaling that I went through was, from 50 to 100 or from 100 to 300. And I think that's an inflection point from multiple different vectors of what used to be in that startup to what it is becoming, right? As a more mature company, right? Transition. And I think the scaling is an umbrella term to a lot of changes. And I'll just pick a few to make it more tangible. One is, you're moving basically from a very command and control centralized decision making where the founder, the CEO, the VP product are involved in every single definition, right? Or design reviews or setting the specific OKRs or the key results on an individual level or a team level to a place where suddenly this does not scale. You need to parallelize efforts and you need to push down decision making. And many times that's very, very difficult. Right? People are afraid because the moment you lose control, or right, you're pushing down this, you're not controlling, you can't control your own destiny, right? And that's very frightening for people who are accustomed to and build the success of their company up to that point through control, right? Yeah. So I think that's like one element to it. The second element is there's an expectation in one of the companies that I worked for that we just doubled the number of engineers on the team, that the productivity will also double overnight. And it doesn't. Because for all kinds of different reasons. One is, does the architecture layer actually allow for many more engineers to work in parallel without being dependent on each other? Question number one. Question number two, is it very clear what each one should be doing? Not always. So maybe you have mission statements. Then how do you manage, and make sure that the quality is not jeopardized as a result, right? And suddenly you have much more controls around the quality. When you deploy and release, there's a whole set of things that need to happen. And it's not just, I just call my buddy and we just deploy or release something, right? So I think there's a lot of that as well. And I think there's a third set of challenges, which is the moment you move from generalists to specialists, there is much more need to define roles and responsibilities in a very, very clear-cut manner. Mm-hmm. Now, that is very tricky because of two reasons. One is that transition from generalist to specialist is not clear-cut, right? You start to bring more and more people so that you have more specialists, but you still have generalists. So making that transition from a people management perspective and a psychological perspective is difficult, right? So I think that's one level. And the second level, even if we have engineering level number 2 in 3 different teams, right? 3 different people, it also means that these are people that have spikes perhaps in different areas, right? So you can't just slap a one-size-fits-all process on all teams. And engineer number 2 in team number 1 is very strong in process, mm-hmm. right? Engineering number 2 in team number 2 is very strong in problem solving from a tech side, right? And then on the third one maybe has a different spike. So how do you blend them with the right counterparts in product, in design, in subject matter experts, right? Project management, maybe others, to then have each one continue to have the spikes, but create that sum that is larger than its parts, right? A cohesive team. I think that's where you need to over-index on, not necessarily on standardizing the process across all different teams, which I've seen quite a few times across different companies, and I think that's perhaps one of the pitfalls. I hope that answers your question.
Beautifully. It answers it very well. Thank you. I wanted to ask a follow-up question to that was, you mentioned that in some of the companies that you work with, they had that, command and control, as you said. I think it was like a top-down approach. How did you navigate successfully through that type of culture during that transition, maybe when that company was maybe going more flat or more spread? What strategies or what things did you try to adopt in order to make that a successful kind of transition?
Great question. And I don't think I have all the right answers, right? I have lots of scars of things that I tried and failed, but perhaps also things that worked. Let me try with that worked because I think it's a shorter list. It's deeply understanding what is the root concern of someone who's at a point where they need to let go, right? Mm-hmm. If it's, look, I'm accountable to the board and I need to show progress on a month-over-month basis, right? And my credibility there is already shaken. That's a very different scenario from I'm just not used to do this. I don't know how to do something else, right? And I think starting there is very, very helpful in, again, identifying the problem helps you then come up with the right solution. So spending time in assessing that is very, very helpful and has helped me repeatedly. That's one thing. The second is, which I think it's a cliche by now, but start small, prove success, and then expand. So, for example, making the transition from functional teams or small teams into cross-functional teams, start with a pilot, with one team only, identify the right change agents, treat it as a learning process, right?
Yeah.
Have very clear, I would say, mutual sets of expectation what success looks like, both within the team, but also between the team and senior leadership and management. Then manage that process accordingly to show ongoing progress towards that. And I think the more you go through those transitions, the more you can really pinpoint what matters the most to the relevant stakeholder, and then also manage something which is realistic to achieve. And the moment you show that, then suddenly people are okay, we see all the benefits that come together with that, and we can scale, and then it's easier, right? It's not, right? But other than that, I tried many other things that, probably failed.
Because it was one of my questions I wanted to ask. I know during that growth and scaling and, joining new companies, what were the things that didn't work? Like any frameworks that you tried or approaches that kind of fell on their face that maybe you could share? Yeah,
or very early on, as I said, alluded to earlier on, I tried to slap a one-size-fits-all model. I spent time assessing and I said, okay, I think this is the blueprint that everyone needs to follow. And because of the people, because of that's one aspect to it, it didn't work. Another aspect, which I think is really, really important when you start thinking about scaling and different teams focusing on different surface areas within your product, is what's the level of ambiguity in the problem space? Because if you're trying to build or rebuild a building system, that has been done thousands of times, right? So I don't think there's a lot of ambiguity. It may be technically difficult, right? But it's still clear what you need to do. It's just going and executing according to a plan. But if you're trying to innovate and create something that the world has not seen before, then you will probably push through much more ambiguity and lack of clarity. And the team needs a different operating system or operating manual that allows them to fail fast, to validate things, right? And right, it's much less of a classic, project planning and deliverables that you need to deliver on a specific timeline. So I think just having that, almost like these two very important variables, the people that you will be working on within the team, what's the level of experience, what are their spikes, does the team have a cohesive, right, ability, who should you be speaking with? It doesn't have to be a product manager. Who should you be speaking with about the strategy, right? It can be a very strong designer or maybe very strong engineer. That's one aspect. And I think the second aspect is almost like putting this on a vector, on a continuum between this problem has been solved many, many other times, and this problem is being solved for the first time, right? And this is true innovation. And where does the projects fall on that? And then start thinking about what's the right operating manual for that particular team and have that flexibility.
Awesome. Okay. I'm sure a lot of people are going to really appreciate that knowledge. Thank you for sharing that. Wanted to maybe piggyback off what you were saying there in terms of that solutioning around a lot of problems has been done, I think, repeatedly, in different organizations. Technology, in my opinion, is quite commoditized these days. So I want to kind of shift the conversation towards the future in terms of where do you see things going? I think you mentioned in the past that, the period of it's difficult to build a product, is gone. And, you mentioned that the book Lean Startup is mandatory in many ways to know, but insufficient as well. So in your opinion, I wanted to ask what's the next wave of product leaders that will, come to be, and how will it change the way that we build products?
So first of all, I have immense respect to Lean Startup, and I think it is absolutely mandatory. So I don't want anyone to misunderstand my intent there. But maybe let me try and explain. Right, I think we're going through waves, right, and the waves become faster and they're coming our way faster and faster, right. And I think when you look at the last big wave and what's the next big wave, right? The last big wave allowed us with, I think, AWS, now Azure, Google Cloud, others just make things much easier to build and significantly decrease the costs. And as a result, I think it's no longer a cliche to say two people in a garage can actually build a really good product, right, and launch it. Now, I'm not underestimating the complexity of building sophisticated and complex products, but I'm saying getting to a place where you have something which is working and pushing it out on an app store, I think, and we see it that, there's an exponential increase in the number of apps that are delivered to these marketplaces. What we are missing is that it's still the same people, right? So what you're fighting for is their attention.
Yeah.
And I think that's one big problem, and that's why I also think, there's lots of room for PLG, where it basically marries together, on the one hand, the product and the value proposition together with the acquisition strategy, right, in a way that also allows you to monetize, but also to bring in the right people in. And, before that it was growth and other things. So I think that's like one element that we need to take into consideration when you think about how the ecosystem has evolved. So the attention, right? It's the attention economy. I think that the second part is that because there are so many products out there, and because it's becoming easier to build up products, the ones that actually surface up and are being adopted are the ones that are differentiated and create such a superior and differentiated user experience for many, many users, right? And I think that's why when I read Lean Startup, I think the principles there, which is go out and validate things, is absolutely correct. But assuming that an MVP will capture, right, a significant portion of the market share, yes, if it's a 0 to 1 experience in the sense that there's nothing out there today, right, and you're solving a very, very big problem. So even if your product is imperfect but still delivering disproportionate value, absolutely. But I think we have less and less of those in a sense. And the bar around the experience is going up and up and up and up. And as a result, I think it's easier to build, but it's more difficult to drive the adoption through really, really good experiences. Now, the experiences are based on the number of iterations you can run. And now, if you don't get the initial adoption, because it's more difficult from an attention perspective, how do you get that validation to build a really superior experience, right? It's a chicken and egg problem. So I think that's like where we are right now. Now, I think if we're looking fast forward, I think we have additional waves coming our way, right? And everybody knows about many years ago we called it big data. Now we call it AI and machine learning, and we're on the spectrum from moving from a one-size-fits-all product to a fully personalized and customized product per person almost, right? With advanced data and analytics. That's another way to differentiate your experiential layer. And we have additional waves of technology like robotics, or RPA, robotics processing automation, which also I think allows to speed up a lot of things just by taking a lot of the drudgery work or a lot of the administrative work that is involved in different facets of an organization to, again, make things easier for the average engineer, right? In a sense, when they develop, especially large-scale enterprise solutions.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about that because I've been closely following like the whole no-code movement, for example, and with robotic process automation and companies like UiPath and whatnot. But like with the no-code movement specifically, you have companies like Webflow that you could build an entire website now without an engineer. And then you have companies like Bubble that recently raised, I think, 100 million because you could build out your own application with no code platform. So it's very exciting. It's kind of scary, to be honest, for companies like ours who build product, in the fear that we might get obsolete, So like we're always trying to stay at the forefront. But the question I have is like, how can product managers really stay at the forefront of a lot of these technologies and work alongside them by like actually leveraging to their use? Like I've seen some product managers actually have to go and learn some of these tools themselves, like Bubble and things like that, because a client asks for a quick MVP or something, it's a great way for a PM to just go and do it themselves. So I'm curious to get your feedback on that, because like, is there scalability issues on no code solutions over time when you start growing and whatnot?
Yeah, so I'm far from an expert in this space. So I'll just give you my very amateur answer. Now, I think there's a distinction between low code and no code. I think no code is addressing a different problem. It's people who want to develop these apps and experiences, but simply are not technically savvy or don't want to spend the time to become so. So I think that's like no code. And that comes many times with limited ability or flexibility in whatever you're building. I also think there's low code, and low code I think does cater to some segments that are more technically savvy, and I think it allows at certain points in time, right, allows many engineers to perhaps democratize the engineering side of things.
Exactly.
There's an opportunity for that, but still I see many times that you start the solution there, and then the engineer then basically takes that and builds up a whole code on top of that allows that to then be plugged into enterprise solutions and other things like that. So I think that's like, a first distinction there that is, I think, important to make. I also think that if you look at the market today, there's shortage in what talent? Engineering talent, right? It's not that companies that go down. Yeah. So I don't think it's the companies necessarily want to go to low code and no code solutions many times. It's more out of, if only we could have hired faster and more engineers, fantastic. But given that we can't, what is a almost like second best solution? And if that allows us to go through rapid validation, right, around almost like a real product, right, and it's a spectrum between the wireframe, the mock-up, the prototype, the live prototype, and then now we have no code and low code, right up to the full product. It allows you to add additional layer of functionality to a live prototype, which allows, I think, for a further layer of validation from a product management perspective, which I think could be very, very helpful to speed up, again, things, get them to the market with a higher confidence it's actually hitting the mark.
No, it's very true. I think you're right. Like the talent is I think a culprit that a lot of people are going to these no code and low code solutions because like shit, I got to do this myself. I got to figure it out, right? Nobody else is available. Aran, I wanted to ask, and you've already, I think, covered a lot of this in prior answers, but in the last kind of 5 years, with your experience working in all these different product organizations that you've been part of, what have you really learned as like a leader from those experiences that you could share?
So apart from working within these organizations, I also had the great fortune of coming as a consultant from the outside, and sometimes CEO says, look, can you just come and look at my product organization or how product works with engineering? I sense that it's not really working well, or how product should be working with go-to-market, right? And I think there are some patterns that emerge over time as you work with more and more of those companies. And some of them I've evidence and experience on my own, but some of them I just see as I work with these different companies. And I think that it falls down into probably the following. One is who founded this company? And when I say working with companies, it's startups, right? Either Series A, Series B, that's usually the companies that I work with. Who founded the company? If it's a very technical founder, usually you have all kinds of patterns that go together with that. If it's as a business founder, then you have all kinds of patterns that go together with that. If it's and these are the two, I would say, main founders that I worked with up to this point. From a technical perspective, usually it's very focused on the technology. Solution comes first, then you figure out what's the market for that solution. And you go through all, and then also it's a very engineering heavy culture where there's not enough, I would say, investment into discovery and into validation efforts. It's more like, let's build something, ship something, and the faster we ship and the more we ship, we can validate things once they're out in the market. And in certain aspects it's true, but in certain aspects it creates all kinds of, I would say, user experience debt and other things. So I think that's like one element within the technical founders side of things. And within that, many times it's the product itself evolves organically, I would say, almost like reactively, not proactively. So you may see one part here, one part there, one part there. It's not really standardized. There is no coherent, consistent experience across the different facets of the product. And it's because of Conway's law, right? Because we had 3 teams, each one working on a different side of the product. Yeah. And the user couldn't care less who worked on what. They just want an end-to-end experience. So that's another downstream effect that happens from there. On the other end, I would say, right, from a business perspective, some founders, not everyone, some are amazing and very attuned to the technology needs. But many times it's not having the right investment into the infrastructure layer, right? And the technical debt, and how do you grow that over time, and how do you make sure that the core is strong, even if it's not directly visible to a user or to a customer, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's like one element to it. The second is, again, we hear from one customer, so yeah, we have to build this. Why? Because this customer said so. How many customers do you have? Hundreds? And you listen to one to build this like big feature, and okay, go and validate. This is actually a market need, and how do you triage that? So, and I think product management in general is maturing, right? And I'm very happy I'm saying that. But 10 years ago, 15 years ago, right? I think product management still had to fight for its place around the decision-making table, right? The senior executive leadership team. Today, it's almost like a given. You need a VP product, you need a chief product officer as part of these companies. And I think having them in place and being the connective tissue between the business side and the technology side and the experience side or the design side is really vital in building successful products, but also monetize them and making sure the business is viable, while making sure that the technical side is taken care of, and we're not over engineering, but we're also attending to what the needs are as the company grows.
Mm-hmm. No, it's very true, and I think the part about what kind of founder is technical versus sales is so bang on. I've seen such different conversations take place with a lot of our clients where they're just totally oblivious to some of the technical decisions that need to be made, or the technical debt, as you said. So very, very true. Next question I have is when you've been working in these companies, I'm sure you create some, each company is unique in many ways, but how do you create benchmarks around success? Like, how do you know if you're doing well within that organization from a product perspective? And how do you determine like the areas that you need to improve?
So over time, I developed what I call a product audit, very similar to a financial audit, where you have a benchmark from the outside and then you compare, right? And you see if you are adhering to that, yes or no. And I think it's broken down into three different elements. One is around the people. Do we have the right people in the right places? Do we have any major glaring gaps there that prohibit us from making the right decisions and pushing towards building the right products? The second, it's the product itself. What's the level of maturity of the product? Everybody says we hit product market fit. Is it really true? And what happens after we hit product market fit, right? And if we're before that, then where are we on that journey towards that? And what are the intentional investments we put in place into that? And maybe we have a diversity of products like the example I gave before, but it's just not creating a cohesive end-to-end experience for customers. So where are we there as well? And the last piece is around the process. So if we have the people in place and this is the product, how do we connect the two together? First within the product management function, but even much more so, it's between the product engineering and design in most companies, but then also between this trifecta and the rest of the company, because you will continue to have pressure from sales and from CS, right? And you need to find a way that you can, on the one hand, satisfy short-term needs, but don't jeopardize your long-term plan and strategic goals, right? To build up a really successful product and have that in place. So each one of them is broken down into probably 10, 15, 20 focus areas and questions. And then the product audit, basically, I come in and ask whoever I've been hired by, usually the CEO, what are you most concerned about? What are you challenged by? What are you trying to solve by me coming in? Mm-hmm. And I think by that, then we calibrate where I should index on. And then it's a 2-week process, very, very quick, again, using a lot of the anthropological methods. It's a semi-structured interview process with access to documentation. And that goes back, by the end of week 1, already with here are some initial hypotheses that allow me to then double down on what needs further, I would say, validation or exploration in week 2. Mm-hmm. That provides, I think, a good understanding of where that organization is. While I try always to say, okay, when I compare your organization to other comparable organizations, I think that's where you're really strong at, and you should definitely recognize that within your team. But here are some areas that you should definitely grow, because I think it's almost like a relatively low effort and high impact opportunity to really like drive better decision making, and as a result, better execution, better everything else, and deliver better products to the market.
I think any product leader going into any organization should do this exact same thing that you're talking about, doing the product audit, really aligning with the leadership team, understanding like what are you concerned about. I think that's like the best question I've heard in a long time. I think every CEO needs to be thinking about what keeps them up at night, right?
Yeah.
What are they concerned about? That would be great if if you're always open to sharing this product audit of yours, I'm sure the audience would love to have a glimpse. But just a couple more questions for you, Eran. I wanted to ask, and this is kind of maybe a fun question, but what is an example of a product related experience that you had that you will never forget, good or bad?
Yeah, I think the first time I used Kindle, many years ago. I lived in Israel, and access to books in English was, you had to order it, and it cost lots of money, and you had to pay taxes, and until it got shipped to your house, you forgot that you even wanted to read that book, right? So having that immediate access into like an ocean of knowledge, that was just, for me, it was like mind-boggling, really mind-boggling. So I think that's like one element. I think also, and I really like always, every time that someone says, oh, great products are the ones that are like Steve Jobs' iPhone, I say, yes, these are definitely great products, but there's also another category of great products that are not visually compelling, right? And we need to recognize them as well. And I think Kindle, especially in the early days, was a very ugly, sorry to say that, product, but it again delivered so much value that no one could care less about how it looked like. And I think that's one of the core things that I always try to focus on within product management is, are we creating disproportionate value? Are we truly doing that? Is there a true differentiation here? And if so, then users will be much more patient around the experience and how visually compelling it is and everything else, right? So.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I just want to get two more questions in. Okay, give me short answers if you want. My first question is, as a product leader, you're making tough choices, tough decisions all the time. Where do you go to get advice or guidance?
So I always found, and it's even in my personal life, I read a lot of social theory. And social theorists always have been the place where I go to ask questions and get answers. They're indirect, right? But there's a lot of mechanisms, a lot of, so Daniel Kahneman, that's an example, right? The Nobel laureate, Anthony Giddens in sociology, and Clifford Geertz in anthropology. I think a lot of what they write is about human nature and how we make decisions and trade-offs. And I think that has been super helpful to me. That's one element. And the second, I'm very blessed to be part of a larger peer group of great people, right? That I can pick up the phone and say, what do you think about this? And they go like, are you crazy? You're thinking about this completely wrong, right? And so having that as well has been very, very comforting as well.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for sharing that. Last question, and then we'll wrap up here today. I don't know how to put it. How do you find another version of yourself? Like, how do you spot the next Eran? Like, what do you look for in those candidates in your company or externally when you want to hire them?
So first of all, I don't look for another version of me. I think one is enough. I create a lot of bad things as well, not just good things. But more seriously speaking, I always over-indexed on diversity of opinion, diversity of backgrounds. I think that's one of the things that I learned over time, that if you just hire more people like you, then there's not going to be any really fertile conversation. The things that I do look for right across the board is intelligence, curiosity, growth mindset in the sense that they have strong opinions, but they're open enough to change if they see evidence and they want to learn, right, and experiences. And people who are naturally they're capable of asking difficult questions in a way that is not controversial, right?
That's a skill. Yeah.
That's a skill, and I think some people, and that's fantastic to have on teams, right?
Yeah.
Have those people. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Eran, so thank you so much. That was awesome. Lots of great insight. For sure, I think everybody's going to really enjoy this specific recording. So thanks again. For everybody listening, tune in next time for another product innovation series episode. So stay tuned.